As September kicked off, we saw Royal Blood return to the scene, dropping a tasty little album for us. Fitting between their busy schedule of telling families and kids at Radio 1 Big Weekender that they have no taste in music. But generally speaking, I've loved all of Royal Blood's releases since their debut. And they've always charmed me with their unique sound that developed an individual character both on their debut follow-up and Typhoons, providing something different to the scene, with the duo focusing on their firepower of pure bass guitar and caveman drumming. And the time I saw them live a few years back at Leeds Festival was a treat, where the drummer downed a fancy glass bottle of gin, spat it all over his drum set, and then proceeded to kick everything over on the stage. It was truly a glorious sight to behold, and their performance was absolutely top tier as well. And throughout Royal Blood's first 3 albums, they managed to develop their sound and give each album its own unique identity, while still maintaining the core of what makes Royal Blood, and well, sound And it's interesting, as we've seen some bands drastically change up their sound to the point where a lot of fans no longer feel connected to the work, whereas other bands kept their sound so similar, ended up ultimately burning them out in many ways. So to me, I was impressed with all Royal Blood's albums so far, in the way they could maintain their relationship with what they originally built alongside their original fan base, yet also being able to add a twist to each album, complementing their efforts as musicians. Yet when it comes to their new release, Back to the Water Below, things aren't quite as clear-cut for the direction they went in, begging the question of if Royal Blood have lost their edge, and what made each album unique yet grounded in so many ways. Now, straight from the bat, it's necessary for me to state that I think this album is an absolutely fantastic rock album, and a great standalone project, with slick cut tones that make me feel as if I'm James Bond strolling through a secret mission looking both slick and sexy. But as someone who's been a fan of Royal Blood for a while now, it's hard to tell where the band is headed with this album, as the songs really don't sound like they have that unique selling point which each individual album tends to have, and almost just sound like generic Royal Blood sounds that could have been at any point in their first 2 albums. But maybe that was the intention with the album, to sound like it could be from their debut as titled Back to the Water Below. But maybe that's a cop-out and I'm just kind of reaching a bit. The first 2 albums had some serious identity to them and felt unique bursting onto the scene, with the duo providing us with something that we hadn't seen maybe since the White Stripes, albeit with a more heavy sound. And I loved Typhoons as an album, as it felt like Royal Blood had taken a different edge and taken the band in a slightly different direction, and almost like a reinvention of their sound without deviating from the core of what makes them fantastic. But with this album, whilst I love it, it doesn't feel like a step forward, but nor does it feel like a step back. It's some sort of standstill as an album. I'm somehow blown away by the sheer power of what Royal Blood is and their excellent style and their take on rock music, yet I'm still underwhelmed by what feels like a lack of character on the album to me. And that's walking a fine line, I suppose, on a double-edged sword, as you've produced an album that sounds brilliant and will likely get a lot of traction from people when they give it a single listen, but you also run the risk of maybe pushing away some of those fans who have been there for every album. But looking at the track list, there were a lot of songs I did really like from this album, such as Mountains at Midnight, Shiner in the Dark, Pull Me Through, and High Waters, which all sound like classic Royal Blood songs, but almost sort of too generic to the point where it just sounds like Royal Blood in general, with no specified destination, despite still being epic in the nature and production of the songwriting for the track, which ultimately is quite confusing in comparison to what Royal Blood have previously released. It doesn't feel like there's a specific stamp on it, if that makes any sense. And I thought the ending of the album was going really well, with There Goes My Cool and Waves, bringing strong rock opera themes, and I think it's slightly where they should have maybe aimed for the whole production of the album to go, to give it that solid identity, where There Goes My Cool sounds reminiscent of Queen in a lot of aspects. But much like this album in general having that confusing double-edged sense to it, the ending of the album is going fantastic and then just abruptly ends with Waves. And I had to double check that the album hadn't crashed or something just to be sure, which isn't the best way to end a record in my opinion. I think overall I really still like this album, and it's got a great sound to it, but I suppose I was expecting a little more in some ways from Royal Blood. As I said, the previous albums they've all released have that real strong character to them that make them stand out, not just because they're Royal Blood, but because it's Royal Blood producing an album. And Back to the Waters Below lacked this. It felt kind of reliant on their great sound and great songwriting, making it a fantastic standalone project, but a bit confusing about where to place it in their actual discography, as it doesn't have that specific identity which the other albums had, which means when I hear certain songs by Royal Blood, I can place it on which album it's meant to be on. With a lot of these songs, it could be from any of the albums. So I'm more left wondering, could Royal Blood get away with with releasing a couple more albums like this. I think to a general rock audience, they absolutely could. It sounds great and would appeal to the majority of rock or indie rock fans who might listen on a casual basis. And to be fair, that's a pretty good spot to be in as a band. But to Royal Blood fans, I'm not so sure. I'm definitely not disappointed by the album, or feeling shortchanged by it in any way, as there's a lot of repeat listens left within the record, but it more left me with this sort of puzzled sense of wondering what's to come in the future more than anything else. And if they're to produce more albums without those initial characters, could they get away with just sounding unique and identifiable as Royal Blood? Which I think they might be able to do. I think overall the album felt more like a gentle red flag to me in some ways. Whereas mentioned, bands that I loved fell into the trap of producing music that just sounded kind of like a generic version of themselves, and ultimately losing their edge. But I don't think Royal Blood is anywhere near that stage yet, as they've done nothing but produce brilliant music, and I thoroughly enjoyed this release as well. But it did feel like a nod to something off in the distance in some ways, and ultimately I hope they come back with something that has that Royal Blood stamp on it for the groove of the album. Maybe similar to those last few tracks on Back to the Water Below, with a bit of a rock opera theme. Overall, though, it's still a great album I'd highly recommend checking out if you haven't yet already. Or Royal Blood in general, they're fantastic. As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.